Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 36 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on the battlements of Elsinore Castle. It has just gone midnight, and the guards on duty are cold and nervous. They anticipate that something may come to disturb their watch. It's not an enemy attack they fear, but the arrival of a supernatural apparition. A ghost in the figure of Hamlet, the late King of Denmark, has appeared before them on the previous two nights. He comes again this night and the next, when he reveals to his son, the young Prince Hamlet, that he was murdered by his brother, Hamlet's uncle, who has since assumed the throne and even married Hamlet's mother. The ghost charges the young Hamlet to avenge his death. So begins what is arguably the world's most famous play, The Tragical History of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark by William Shakespeare. The burden of the ghost assignment wears heavy on Hamlet's young shoulders, already pressed down by grief for his father's death and his mother's o'er-hasty marriage. His dangerous and solitary commission is bedeviled by his own moral scruples and his fragile mental stability. And though we know that it cannot go well, we are with him every step of his intense journey. The Tragical History of Hamlet contains all of the elements of great drama: a revenge thriller, a family ripped apart, a tragic love story, political ambition and intrigue, and wondrous poetry and philosophical insights. But most of all, a uniquely intelligent, vibrant, and sympathetic title character, who we see in all his brilliance and frailty. Of course, I knew that we would at some point come to essay the Everest of all plays, that is Hamlet. We are doing so now because a new production is currently running at the Young Vic Theatre in London, with renowned actress Cush Jumbo winning huge acclaim for her androgynous performance in the eponymous role. Hamlet is the Shakespeare play I feel the strongest personal connection to, and probably know the best. I was taken by my parents to a production of it at the Stratford Festival in Ontario, Canada, in the late 1960s, which made a lasting impression on me. I can still conjure up an image of that Hamlet. Dressed in the traditional jet black, his dark hair worn long like a beetle, to my 10-year-old eyes, he was an exhilaratingly athletic and intelligent hero for that or any time. I have since studied the play in detail at school and seen countless productions, so that its language, structure, and psychological dynamics are nourishingly familiar to me. That said, to attempt to summarize in under an hour this mountain of a play, it is difficult not to be daunted. Fortunately, I'm joined today by someone who is eminently qualified to shepherd us to the summit. Greg Hersov is the director of the current production at the Young Vic and has spent his life directing in the theatre. He was the artistic director of the Manchester Royal Exchange Theatre for 27 years, and the CV of plays he directed there reads like the dream catalog for the Play Podcast, with countless classic titles, old and new, including at least 4 Shakespeare plays. In Manchester, he also forged a very successful partnership with his current Hamlet, previously directing Cush Jumbo in the lead roles in As You Like It, Pygmalion, and A Doll's House. Welcome, Greg. Congratulations on your Hamlet at the Young Vic, and thanks so much for joining me.
Hi.
I've mentioned my formative encounters with the play, so I want to ask you what your engagement with Hamlet has been. What has been the history that led you to direct it now? Have you been involved in any previous productions?
Well, it's very interesting, actually, Douglas, hearing your introduction, because it's almost the same as me, that I had a formative experience. I was lucky enough to come from a theatre-going family, so I was taken to the theatre at a young age. So when I was a teenager, I saw Nicol Williamson play Hamlet at the Roundhouse with Anthony Hopkins, Claudius, Marianne Faithfull as Ophelia, Vincent Price as the voice of the ghost. That made a huge impression on me. I mean, it was a highly acclaimed Hamlet. And exactly like you, the character made a huge impression on me. And then I studied it at school. And then I directed it as a student when I was 21 with my own theatre company in Swindon. And I still have the script. I was having a look at it this morning, but there it is.
Wow.
And then it's a play I've always wanted to direct. I haven't been involved in another production professionally, but at the Royal Exchange, I wanted to do Hamlet more than anything. I had 2 very serious attempts. And then I met Cush 10 years ago when I was trying to cast Pygmalion. And a few years after that, before we did A Doll's House, I remember sitting in my office thinking, she's the Hamlet I've been waiting for, because I think, as a director, you have to know who your Hamlet's going to be. I think it's ridiculous not to. And I just thought, if she acts Hamlet, that's going to make sense for me in the times we're living in. However, it was a kind of secret dream on my part. I didn't know her own trajectory towards the role. So when she phoned me up a few years back and said, let's do Hamlet, it was like a dream come true, really. And like you, it's a play I've seen quite a lot of productions of, and I've, of course, studied the text for many years. So it's the kind of culmination of a dream, this production.
It's a dream come true, as you say, for both of you. Before we dive into the play, I'd like to go back to the start and ask you about Shakespeare's writing of the play. Where does Hamlet fit into the chronology of his career?
Well, as you know, this is always a much discussed thing, but I'm very influenced by James Shapiro's 1599, which I think for me is one of the best books about Shakespeare that I've read in the last few years. It's written with such verve and accessibility, and it's fascinating. So I do like the idea that he was writing this at the end of 1599 of an extraordinary year with the New Globe Theatre. It feels like an end-of-century play where he wanted to kind of splurge in a way that he'd never done before as a writer. Where does it fit? I think for me, it's probably the pivotal play where he's developing I think it's called interiority by Stephen Greenblatt, the ability to write characters thinking in the moment. It seems to me it's the big play that he expresses that more fully than anything else, basically through Hamlet, but actually through all the characters when you start to really analyze it. So I feel like it's a summation of his earlier work and a pivot point to his later work.
Great. Actually, 1599, you mentioned the Shapiro book is absolutely wonderful. It is the most memorable and vivid thing I've ever read about Shakespeare, and it's so evocative of its era. And that year, 1599, was extraordinary. The story of Shakespeare and Richard Burbage and the Lord Chamberlain's men dismantling the theatre in Shoreditch, board by board, and carrying it across the Thames and re-erecting it as the Globe on the South Bank is just amazing. And that year, he wrote Henry V, As You Like It, and Julius Caesar. And as you say, Shapiro suggests that Hamlet followed those 3 at the latter part of 1599 and was probably put on in the Globe sometime in 1600, although no one can be definitive about these things. As you say, also was written towards the end of Elizabeth I's reign. So I think there is that sense of something coming to an end and something new potentially about to happen. And of course, we do see a succession of sorts in the play itself. I also understand from a little reading I've done, but also from the program of the production, Greg, that there is a checkered provenance for the text itself, so that there is not really an authoritative version of the text. There were 3 different texts published, is that right? And I wanted to know, how did you then approach what text to use?
Yes, I mean, I read the most modern up-to-date thinking about the text. There are people who claim there's a definitive text from Q2 to F. I don't think anyone's claiming Q1 is a definitive text because it's a different kind of play, really. I approached it from, concretely, I worked from the updated Arden edition and the new Cambridge edition. So I worked from 2 up-to-date editions with all the footnotes and the readings. And then I worked from the F version because the Arden up-to-date version, the latest one, is only Q2. Mm-hmm. And so I cross-referenced that with the folio version and made the edited text that I've done, which involved which bits to leave out, which bits to select, but also, and I think this is very important, word readings, because word readings are completely different in Q2 and F, and there's a different word readings in Q1. So for instance, just a tiny example, when Gertrude is describing her marriage and explaining why Hamlet might be upset, she could say our hasty marriage, our over hasty marriage, or our hasty marriage. Those are three different readings. And in Hamlet's, oh, that this too solid flesh could be, oh, that this too solid flesh, or oh, that this too sallied flesh. So you often have three readings. And so I had to choose a word reading for each bit, really. So the edited text is a conflation, I suppose, of Q2 and F, but it's also a word readings chosen from actually all three. I think I used a couple from even Q1 on that. So I think as a director, you probably have the attitude, look, I have all this material, let's just shape something, rough hew it how we will, that expresses Shakespeare's intentions in some way. But I think, as I said in my article in the programme, I think all a director can say that, look, we're going to do our Hamlet. There's no correct or incorrect way of doing this wonderful, mysterious, vast play. And basically, you simply must commit to your own vision and do that, really. And that's what we try to do. Yeah.
Yeah, well, gosh, you've given us a glimpse that there's quite a lot of work put in before you get anywhere just to decide what the text is going to be, which of course you don't have with a modern text, obviously Shakespeare out of copyright, so you can decide what to choose. But just for those who are not familiar, Q1 is a first quarto, was the first edition published in, I think, 1603, a couple of years only after the show first went up, I guess. As you say, you talk about the word differences. There's actually substantial differences between these various editions in terms of what speeches are included or the order even of the scenes. And the first quarto is only slightly more than half as long even as the second or the folio editions. The second quarto, a properly published full-length version, which was published very shortly thereafter. And then the folio version, which was published in 1623 after Shakespeare had died, which contained text for all his plays. And again, that's different again. The thing about the second and the folio editions also I found interesting, Greg, was that they're both of them too long to actually have been performance texts, that they would never have been formed as they were because they would have been more than 4 hours long. And I don't think Elizabethan audience, let alone our modern audience, would tolerate that. And there was also speculation, wasn't it, that the first quarto might have been a version recorded in memory by someone who was in the play. It was more akin to the performance version, but it was more corrupt as well. I wanted to also ask you about where the story comes from, because Shakespeare didn't actually usually make up his plots himself, did he? So where did he get the story of Hamlet from? Do you know?
Well, I think it comes from a Danish, I think it is a Danish folktale, Hamlet, I think, but via a couple of other translations. So, I mean, as with most of his plays, he had about 3 sources. So I think there was a kind of, there was an original Hamlet story. And some people think an old Hamlet play that actually existed, that he'd have seen. So, yes, you have about 3 or 4 source things to look at. And of course, what's interesting is what he added, what he left out. So I spent a bit of time on that. But again, I don't think there's a definitive history of this at all from anyone, is there?
No, what I read was there was, as you say, a 12th century Danish saga of a Scandinavian king, Hamlet. And interestingly, all of the main characters we see in Shakespeare's play are in this legend. Hamlet, old and young, the king and queen, Polonius, Ophelia, Horatio, Rosencrantz, and Guildenstern even. And the plot is very much the same. I don't think we need to rehearse what the plot of Hamlet is for my educated listeners, but essentially the old king is murdered and the young prince has to revenge his father's murder. He actually puts on a madness to disguise his intent, and he even kills the equivalent of Polonius by accident. All of these things happen in this original saga. And as you say, there was also some suggestion that there might have been a play on the London stage in the 1580s of this sort of story as well. But of course, as you rightly say, it isn't the plot in Shakespeare's plays that he's renowned for. It's what he's done with it in terms of the language and the psychologies. And in fact, of course, in the most important way, in the role of Hamlet himself. I mentioned it's the Everest of plays. It's probably the Everest of acting roles as well, isn't it, Greg? The character with the most lines in all of Shakespeare. You wanted to do it for a long time, and Cush, you said, did as well. What do you think makes it such an irresistible part and a challenge for an actor?
Well, I think it's the fact that Shakespeare was interested in trying to create a character who lived intensely every single moment on stage. with a variety of intelligence, passion, vulnerability, rawness, brilliance, that kind of shines like a light and then literally is extinguished at the end. I mean, I think that Shakespeare creates a character who is simply inhabiting the stage in a way that I don't think it's ever been done before. I actually don't think it's ever been done since. That any actor, well, it can't be any actor, because to be honest, you have to be a certain kind of actor to attempt Hamlet.
What kind of actor would you say that is?
I think you need to be an actor who's very quick-witted, has a sense of how to kind of process a lot of thoughts at the same time. You have to be emotionally fearless. You have to be very imaginative. You have to be able to fill every detail and every moment. So I think only certain actors can play Hamlet, to be honest. And if you look at it, mostly the actors who do attempt Hamlet have those qualities. It's rare to see a Hamlet that's wrong from the first moment. You know, it's too stolid or can't think quickly enough. I mean, I think most actors know, either I can play Hamlet or I can't. But I think it's that kind of flickering, shining brilliance, and it's the potential all the time in the figure of the prince. This was terribly important to me and Cush, that we wanted to think about what a prince meant now. The prince was always the hope of the future in Shakespeare's time. And I think we kind of saw Hamlet as not a prince of royal blood. I mean, inherited, all that stuff isn't interesting. There are other princes that there have been in modern times. There's Prince himself, the musician, for instance. They're people who are a beacon for a becoming generation, for a generation growing up but facing the brutality of power for the first time. And I think we see Hamlet as being the great spokesperson of all those hopes and fears and dreams and vulnerabilities of that generation. So that's the way we've approached the prince.
That's fantastic. You're right about a certain type of actor, because, of course, one of the things that comes across, as I said in the intro, I suppose, is it's just a sheer brilliance, isn't there? There's an intelligence that we're all immediately aware of. And as you say, the quick thinking, but also interesting, as you say, that youth and that star quality. The phrase star quality came to my mind as you were talking about this person being a beacon for a generation. And actually, of course, when I say he, and you talk about the type of actor, clearly one of the most distinctive things about your casting and working with Cush is that she is not a he. How did that play into what you thought about between you, how you approached this role?
That's a really good question. First of all, I mean, people would often ask about, this is a huge statement, given who Cush Jumbo is. And I just used to say, look, she's the best actor I've met in the last 10 years. I want to do Hamlet with her. I don't even think about any other actor playing Hamlet than Cush. It's, as you know, the history of female leading actors playing Hamlet goes back to 1770. There's no accident that all the great female actors wanted to play Hamlet. There's something in the part, and I think it's because Shakespeare was trying to create a different kind of male protagonist hero, someone who didn't conform to the revenge code, someone who wasn't a kind of masculine figure in the conventional way. So I think Hamlet as a potential part is always open and has always been open to that. How we approached it was that, Hamlet is a he in our production. We're not playing it as a female character, but on the other hand, we're not particularly worried about what we're doing. We're simply playing the character as we see it. I think having a female actor as Hamlet makes some of the relationships come alive in a way that perhaps it's harder with a young male actor. I think with Ophelia and Gertrude particularly, I think that's quite interesting, having a female actor to bring a certain sensibility to those particular scenes. And others, but I'm not going to generalize about that. I just wanted, particularly with Gertrude and Ophelia, I wanted the opportunity for the actors playing them to be able to really connect with the actor playing Hamlet. And I think sometimes in production, you get a young male Hamlet ranting away. And, it's easy to do that, for heaven's sake. When I was 21, that was exactly what it was. But I kind of feel like with wisdom and age and where we are now with gender fluidity and everything, you want to try and give a little more depth and perspective to those things. And I think having a female actor playing Hamlet in that sense is a great asset. But to be honest, we just talked about the character all the time. There was no question that Hamlet was going to be a he in inverted commas, because the prince, in terms of power and politically, has that kind of position. But, for me, as I said, it's just, if you have a genius of an actor, then you just want to work with them as Hamlet. I didn't even think about anyone else.
Well, I think it's a tribute to the production to Cush that actually this, as you say, this isn't really something that becomes an issue when you're watching it. You're just watching Hamlet and watching a wonderful performance. And then perhaps she's bringing a more thoughtful and sensitive characterization. As you say, Hamlet is not a run-of-the-mill macho character. So she obviously captures some of that quality, but you don't think of her as effeminate, or gender just doesn't really come into it. And the relationships with Ophelia and Gertrude, well, we'll come to talk a little bit about them. I was going to next move on to saying what we remember most about the play, of course, are the soliloquies, Hamlet's deeply personal, poetic, and philosophical speeches. And you said at the beginning, I think, that this is the interiority, and that this may be one of the first times that we see the inner thoughts, the psychological drama of a character with such intensity. What do you see as the purpose of these soliloquies?
Well, I think the purpose is to reveal the kind of interior mind of Hamlet at any given point. I mean, it was interesting how it worked. I mean, I obviously transposed To Be or Not to Be back in the play much earlier, which is a choice that can be made. I saw it as being part of Hamlet's melancholia, I say madness in quote unquote. So it felt like that contemplation of, is it worth going on living, as being something that happened a little bit earlier. Their speeches, I think, to be discovered in the moment.
Yeah.
We approached them very much from internal thinking and then decided to share them outward with an audience with that internal feeling later on in rehearsals. And the interesting thing about Rogue and Peasant Slave, this is where editing is interesting for me, and I was quite surprised to discover one could do this, that by a little bit of snippet where you don't set up the murder of Gonzago before the soliloquy, which it is in the text, you see Hamlet discovering the plays as a thing during the speech as a result of the soliloquy. And I found that quite exciting. So to make a fresh discovery during the soliloquy in that kind of way. So I think they're vivid snapshots. In my script, which I split up into 58 scenes, I had a title, and there were also other Hamlet alone bits. Oh, all you host of heaven, 'tis now the very witching time of night. So there are moments throughout the play, even apart from the soliloquies, where Hamlet is on his own and revealing thoughts, and they tend to take you much further into the character, but further along the whole journey throughout the whole play, I think.
Yeah, that's true too. I mean, you do get exposition, of course. That's the practical point of the soliloquies. But I think you're so spot on about how, if they're done well, how they become vivid, real-time snapshots of his thinking. That's hard to do because the language is so familiar as well to us. So they seem like set speeches. It's an even bigger challenge for the actor to actually make them feel like he's just thinking this for the first time. They've been talked about as if they're modern in style in some way, because we get this insight into a psyche, which reveals perhaps even a modern person, in that he's a complex, uncertain, self-critical, self-conscious, skeptical about the world, and very self-aware as well. That these seem to be modern traits psychologically. But it was interesting, you also said about where you positioned To Be or Not to Be. So this fascinated me because I couldn't come to grips with how this is worked out. Firstly, as you also said, are these soliloquies meant to be overheard? Is he talking to himself, to the audience? In fact, in the traditional positioning, correct me if I'm wrong, of To Be or Not to Be in Q2 and the folio, in I think Act 3, Ophelia is still on the stage, and the king and Polonius may even be within earshot, may even be able to overhear this soliloquy, which seems to me slightly strange, that he would be unburdening these suicidal thoughts in the hearing of others. Is that how it was intended to be, or is that why you also moved it? Because you moved it, as I believe, closer to where, or even where it is in Q1, which is just after the scene with Polonius, words, 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 where he's taunting him as a fishmonger. Is that what it was about? Whether he's overheard as well as where it fits in his psychological journey?
I think the point you've raised is an extremely good one, and it was certainly at the back of my mind that what does that actually mean? I've read that some Hamlets have done To Be or Not to Be to Ophelia, which I don't understand at all.
No.
I think if you look at the setups in each of the versions, there's a kind of awkwardness about how the meeting with Ophelia is set up. it's not clear, like there are a few other things about how Shakespeare sets things up and pays things off. And so I just think instinctively, I just always felt To Be or Not to Be was not going to be in the nunnery scene, as I put it. I just thought that straight away. And then we talked about where it went earlier, and suddenly putting it after the Polonius thing with these tedious old fools seemed to play to the frustration of a becoming generation rather well.
Aha.
I think some people normally put it before that, Hamlet just comes on, which you could argue Polonius overhears it or not. But it felt interesting to put it after an encounter, for Hamlet to have gone through something the first time we see him in his melancholic state, full blown. And it seemed to come out of that moment and about the kind of behavior we've heard about him, that he's had a traumatic reaction after the ghost. We hear from Ophelia how strange he's been in that way. So it kind of felt like it came out of that kind of mood. So the short answer is, yeah, I think there are real problems having it in traditional Act 3. I mean, real problems. And I just thought it's just not the right place.
I went and looked actually at the Arden edition, as you mentioned earlier. That's the Q2, I think, and so it's not in that position. But I went back to that scene of words with Polonius and Hamlet and thought, okay, if you put it in there as you did, how does that follow? And I was really struck, Greg, by at the end of that encounter with Polonius, Polonius says, "My lord, I will take my leave of you." To which Hamlet replies, "You cannot take from me anything that I will not more willingly part withal, except my life, except my life, except my life." Well, it seems to me a pretty seamless step into To Be or Not to Be from those words.
Yes, no, absolutely. And also before Rosencrantz and Guildenstern come on, which was nice too, as a kind of attempt to go somewhere else.
Yes, indeed. So the soliloquies, of course, he needs to unpack himself. He's got a lot on his plate, bursting with internal dialogue and questioning, and no one he can fully share it with. So it's no surprise that he's cogitating over all of these challenges. The central dilemma of the play is his position in terms of how to act on this mission to revenge his father's death. And he parses it out, castigates himself, thinks about it deeply, as we've said. And these deliberations are often addressed as the key questions raised by academics. First is, why does Hamlet delay so long? The age-old question of his procrastination. It seems to be unquestionable that he does procrastinate to some degree. The play goes on for some time. There are examples of other people like Laertes who would have acted more swiftly to execute the revenge. So I wondered how much you had to consider these classic questions about what are the reasons for his delay. Did you talk about this, or is that just an academic exercise?
No, I don't think it's an academic exercise. I think it's the heart of the Hamlet experience is the revenge code. I mean, the revenge code is, if someone does something to my family, I avenge it instantaneously. And I would say that revenge code is still operating around the world. I think your point about Laertes is crucial. I mean, why Shakespeare seems to create a character who has a different attitude to revenge. And indeed, when Claudius asked him, what would you do? He'd say to cut his throat in the church, which is specifically opposite to what Hamlet's done, who has an opportunity to kill Claudius, but says you can't kill a man, however evil, pray. It's very clear.
Yeah.
And Claudius says revenge should have no bounds. So there you have it. The villain of the play endorses the revenge code. Why does Hamlet do that? I think there's a difficulty with the ghost. He talks about the ghost may be a spirit that abuses me to damn me. I think that the ghost is a questionable figure. I mean, it lays down the revenge code, but also, who was old Hamlet really? I mean, was he really this hero figure? I'm not sure. I think he's an unreliable father. I think an inaccessible father. I think something that's died in the world and Claudius has been born. I don't know whether Gertrude loved old Hamlet. I don't think she probably did. So I feel Hamlet senses all these difficulties, but basically Hamlet's being confronted by a spirit, an apparition. Shakespeare is saying there is another world operating. And I think making an audience feel that is the most important thing. I think it's often skated over and said, well, he's just told by a ghost to revenge. What's the problem? You're kind of going, wait a minute, a ghost? I mean, so you believe in the ghost? I mean, you believe in a spirit? You actually think there's an alternative world, a purgatorial spirit? These are huge questions, Glenn. I think we wanted to try and explore the trauma of that for a young becoming person in relation to a supernatural occurrence. And so Hamlet needs to sort things out. And I think that takes quite some time. It's also worth saying that there's a huge difference between Hamlet. Hamlet does come up with a plan, which is the play. That works. He then goes, I'm going to kill Claudius. He has a chance and decides it's not the right time, but he's perfectly happy to kill Claudius. He then kills the wrong person, which seems to indicate, to my mind, that Shakespeare's saying that Hamlet as an action revenger isn't quite the right way. And when Hamlet comes back in the fifth act, he doesn't initiate anything. He simply puts himself there. He says, I'm here, I'm not backing down. And Claudius enables the revenge to happen, literally, in a completely different way. When Hamlet says, the point in venom too, so I'm skipping to the end, then venom to thy point. It's a wonderful way of saying, this is what's happened, I'm here, so I can perform this now. This is nothing to do with me, but this is what's happened. Because that's what happens if you stand up to power. It will eventually reveal itself. But of course, you have to die also, which is tragic.
Yeah, I've always been struck by when he does come back, how he doesn't immediately take action. Mm. You're right about the doubting of the ghost, I think, because throughout the play, there's a whole vision, I don't know whether it's the right word, of an eschatological world of the time, that there is heaven and hell and a devil and fates and destiny and all sorts of powers and forces at play. So that it would be quite natural for him to distrust this spirit and also be concerned about what the future may hold in terms of the afterlife for himself or Claudius, and particularly seeing this ghost who's emanated from some place in the afterworld. So if he kills him, will he be destined to end up there as well? There are all sorts of practical concerns, I'm sure, in this world that, to kill a king would not be a straightforward thing to do. It's unlikely to get away with that with impunity. And also, of course, there's the question about whether he personally is configured for this kind of task, as you say. I mean, he's an intelligent, sensitive young man whose first instinct may not be to kill in cold blood. There's that. And also, this leads to the next question I was going to raise, which is about his mental state. So one of the reasons that's given by academics, critics about his delay is that he's prone to this introspection, rational reflection that goes on for some time. And he even talks about this himself in his last soliloquy, doesn't he? That he has this scruple of thinking too long on things. And he's obviously in a state of mental stress, which could lead to depression, which it's hard to be active in. So I think this leads to the next age-old chestnut, which is, to what degree does Hamlet truly lapse into madness? Or how much is it an assumed antic disposition in which he remains in rational control? Or how much has he succumbed to some sort of psychotic impulses and state of mind? How did you approach that with Cush?
Yes, again, a crucial question. So I think you probably noticed that I made a pretty big editorial choice, which is to cut the idea of putting on an antic disposition, because in a sense, I don't really believe in that, pretending to be mad. I think in Elizabethan times, that meant a whole load of things, not least being quite entertaining on stage. I found that a bit problematical now with our whole attitude to mental health. So the way we approached it was that Hamlet has a severe reaction to the ghost, and that it does induce we use the word depression with a capital D. Those are experiences that I think people for Cush's generation are very, very open to. And also, I think the word melancholia to me is probably more important than depression. I think Mark Fisher, the philosopher, wrote, depression is settling for what's there and being ground down by it. Melancholia is a refusal to accept the world as it is, which leads to an unbalanced way. And I think melancholia for me is probably more accurate, but we drew on lots of very particular feelings of stress and anxiety, which I think emerging generations are feeling, aren't they, in the world, possibly more so than us in a different way. And so that's how we did it. I mean, Hamlet is genuinely unbalanced in this production, but that doesn't mean to say that Hamlet's mad, because the word mad doesn't mean anything to me anyway. Hamlet is unbalanced, but that doesn't mean Hamlet doesn't know what's going on in various places. It's just that Hamlet is going through an immense period of stress and difficulty as a result of this encounter with the spirit.
Well, that's really interesting, because although you did as you say, cut the antic disposition reference, there are other times in the play where he's very self-consciously talks about the fact that he's not mad, using the terminology of the play itself. He tells Rosencrantz and Guernsey he's mad, but north-northwest. When the wind is southerly, I know a hawk from a handsaw, which I actually take as a veiled warning to Claudius. And then, of course, he says to his mother, which we'll come to in the closet scene, I'm not mad, I'm mad in craft. I think the point is, the mix is, it's impossible to differentiate. And you're right that it's perfectly natural in the circumstances he's in that he would be feeling huge stress, anxiety, depression, and the refusal to accept the world as it is. Well, who can blame him? This world has not turned out very well, not anything like the way he would want it to be, in a really shocking way and sudden way, losing his father and then his mother remarrying his uncle. As you said earlier, it's interesting you're talking about his father. I don't think we have enough clues in the play as to what that relationship might have been or what his father was really like, which I think raises some questions about Gertrude, which we'll come to in a second. But ultimately, carrying everything he does, it's beyond imagining how one wouldn't be mentally distressed. Which takes me to Ophelia, who also displays the characteristics of madness of some kind. How are we to interpret what you think of Hamlet and Ophelia's relationship? What do you think the nature of the relationship is before it all kicks off, for example, and then it might explain some of what happens to them both thereafter?
Yes, I think what we came to was it was important that it was a relationship that ignited fully in the 2 months since Hamlet returns for his father's funeral, which gives it that kind of heady feeling of intense connection. I think we felt they'd probably known each other for quite a long time. But, from afar, also Hamlet's been away for a few years at Wittenberg. Ophelia's grown up. And one gets the feeling when he came back trying to face all the problems that happens when he hears the news of his father's death in the 2 months before his mother remarries Claudius and everything happened, that Ophelia would be a huge kind of refuge and a kind of intense connection between two very inward, imaginative figures. I do think there's a bit of Romeo and Juliet there, and I think that's possibly why problematically he doesn't give them any scenes, because maybe he'd done that before. But I very much wanted to create a feeling of Hamlet and Ophelia. I had this image of her dancing with him, listening to some of her music. I felt she was a real music person. And so we created this moment in the production of an imaginary thing in her mind of them dancing together to try and get the feeling of intensity of the emotion, which then means that, weirdly enough, when you first see Hamlet and Ophelia together, technically they're breaking up in the nunnery scene. So it's a very kind of odd way he constructs it. So we tried to create this feeling that would resonate through their relationship.
That leads precisely to my next question is then, why does he treat her so cruelly in the nunnery scene? What happens if they have this relationship connection? What changes his view and behavior towards her?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated because they're both kind of at cross purposes, I think, at the start of the scene. I mean, I think what's important is that Hamlet has made the choice, and we've heard this from Ophelia, description of the nighttime visit, where he does an immense amount of intense things, but he doesn't say anything to her. That Hamlet obviously feels like he cannot tell Ophelia about the ghost and the revenge and all that. So whatever their relationship is, he feels he can't do that. She is frustrated by that because she knows there's something there. She tests him by handing back the remembrances. He is trying to say it's over, but of course it isn't over for him. So there's a kind of confusion going on between them. And this is all to do with Elsinore. It's like Elsinore breaks up their relationship. But then the crucial question, which we try to play as a fresh moment, when he asks her, where's your father? And she says at home, which is not true. And he knows at that point she's lied to him. And that leads to the escalation of language. I'm not trying to justify anything that Hamlet says to Ophelia, but his sense of betrayal, his sense of instability of a female model, because his mother's unstable from that point of view, that he simply lets things rip. And certainly he does treat her extremely badly. I think he has to face that at the end of the play over her coffin, that he's failed completely. But there is a tension within that. I mean, she does not tell him the truth that this conversation's been overheard. So Her difficulty is her relationship with her father and how much she's part of that world and her bid for freedom. And perhaps we saw her disturbed or distracted state, although it's very distressing. There's a curious release of feeling for Ophelia. I'm not recommending it to anybody, but there is a release of feeling for her in that state that she's in. It's very important to me that Ophelia does not commit suicide. I mean, if you look very carefully at what Gertrude says, she's literally gone out on a limb of a tree to hang flowers for what I think everyone to see. And it breaks, because of course it does. And that's very important. She's not someone who is going off to commit suicide. It's a kind of effort at freedom in a sense. But I think they both have a tremendous amount in common. They're both imaginative, inward-looking, very sensitive, very perceptive. And I think that's why they're connected together.
I agree with you entirely that I've always thought that what happens to Ophelia ultimately is more justifiable if there is a real strength of connection between her and Hamlet that you see established, and that it's not superficial. There are some suggestions that, there's an immaturity to their relationship. The love letter that Polonius reads is some juvenile poetry, but they do have this strength of connection, and they're very similar, as you said. And I think the reactions of both of them, the more intense they are, the more it makes sense to both of their behaviors. I think it's very interesting to consider what he's going through, as you really perceptively said, about that scene which can pass you by quite quickly, where he apparently visited her and was unable to speak. He is confronting something which is beyond his, or certainly potentially her, imaginings, and not something he wants to impose on her. Maybe he wants to protect her somehow, but it's also a sort of maturing, a growing up. He's almost having to live in a world sooner than he would want to. He's very young, and these shocking things are happening to him, which is a reality which is nothing like the romance that you have with a girl when you're 21 years old. And those things are not very easily reconcilable. But in this nunnery scene, we are inevitably shocked by the brutality of his behavior towards her. Part of that, as you also say, must come from the idea that not only is he hurt because she's been rejecting him, Polonius has asked her not to entertain him, so he's already feeling that. But then the idea that she's actually lied about Polonius and that she's conniving in some way with her father, that's a betrayal which could push him as well. So there's a natural anger there. Can we talk a little bit about Hamlet's mother, Gertrude? So it's interesting you mentioned earlier about the old King Hamlet, because the question I had was, how do we see her character and behavior in the play? Her marrying her ex-husband's brother within 2 months seems pretty quick in any world. So what do you think her motivations have been and are?
Well, I think it's fair to say, to start off with, I think Gertrude is probably one of the most enigmatic characters that Shakespeare's ever written. I mean, you cannot look at the text and go, we know what Gertrude is thinking, because he almost deliberately doesn't write her like that. In fact, he obviously deliberately doesn't write her like that. I think the feeling I had about it was that I think Gertrude quite likes being queen. I think she believes in maintaining a power position, which she can do by marrying Claudius. She, of course, probably doesn't have much choice, because he's obviously launched a campaign straight away to take over. And, it's an elected monarchy in Denmark. That's a slightly scholastic point, but you can't just take over unless you've got support. And of course, Hamlet technically should have succeeded his father in Elizabethan minds, but his father didn't designate him as successor, which is very interesting. And also his mother, she wouldn't be entirely mistaken to think that this young prince might not quite be ready for the bear pit. So in one sense, marrying Claudius, maintaining her position, protecting Hamlet from Claudius, which is very important for her. She knows, she doesn't know about the murder. I think it's ridiculous to do that. People do make that choice, but I don't think she knows about the actual murder. But she knows Claudius is taking over, and she knows how ruthless Claudius is. They've known each other for 30 years or whatever. So I think her motivations are interesting. Then you come to the thing about attraction, the lusty widow and all that stuff. I think Gertrude is very much someone who's on her own, operating as a female soft power position. We talked a lot about first ladies. We talked a lot about Bridget Macron, Queen Noah. These are women around the world who have power, but they don't change the system. They have to slot in a certain way, even if you're Michelle Obama or Melania Trump. obviously a huge difference between the two, but they're both constricted in their roles. So I think Gertrude wants that. And of course, the tragedy for her is that it disintegrates on every level. Whether she loves Claudius deeply or not, I'm not sure. I think he definitely has a strong desire for her. No question about that. But I tend to use the word desire rather than love. Her desire for Claudius is slightly enigmatic. I think there's something there. But I think in the end, Gertrude is someone who's trying to play a lone hand throughout the play. And in the end, it doesn't work.
That's a really interesting. So largely, I think from what you're saying, there's a lot of pragmatism in her response, that in the circumstances of the court and the succession and her position and her son's position, that all makes a lot of sense. And then there's a whole nother layer, as you say, about really what is the attraction between the two. I mean, you could go way down that track and speculate. Was she having an affair with Claudius before her husband was murdered? She may not have colluded, but that might have been one of the inspirations for Claudius to murder him, as well as the throne. Who knows? That may be a step too far. I have seen productions where the attraction between Gertrude and Claudius is ratcheted up, where you see some intensity, some sexual attractions, and albeit that Hamlet is disgusted by this and talks about her being too old for the impulses of lust. I have seen played where that is part of the deal, and I guess otherwise it would just be entirely pragmatic. But it is it's often part of what goes on in the closet scene, isn't it? Because when Hamlet comes to speak daggers to her, he does get carried away. And one of the classic interpretations is that this is Oedipal. There's something about the displacement there. And he talks about her not going to his bed, and he's discussed about that. So there's a level at which these sort of currents are running. How did you see that playing out in what Hamlet's behavior is to his mother in the closet scene?
Well, I think that, again, I think the closet scene in its fullest version, and of course there are different versions of the scene, is probably one of the most difficult and enigmatic scenes Shakespeare ever written. There seems to be some kind of centering on some primal events here. I'm always quite amused about the Oedipal thing, which is how do actors act the Oedipus complex, which is unconscious anyway. I'm also interested in the fact that Freud was profoundly haunted by Hamlet. So I'm trying to work out which one came first. I mean, I always enjoy reading these psychoanalytical interpretations of Hamlet, but they're extremely hard for an actor to act or a director to actually direct. I actually went quite far with this trying to do that. But how does Hamlet react to it? I mean, I think that, again, the vulnerability of a young man with his mother is quite important, the mysteriousness of her as a role model. But I think he's always identified with his mother possibly more strongly than his father. If you feel his father was a kind of inaccessible hero figure, then his mother is where he got his wit, his ability to act, to put on a mask, I think all sorts of ideas. So I think his sense of who she is and his desperately trying to get through to her what she's done is paramount in the scene. However, I'm not sure what he's saying about Hamlet's father, particularly this great god, makes any impression on Gertrude at all. I think as a mother, she probably feels like I failed completely. On one level, he doesn't understand who his father was originally anyway. And number two, he's a damaged young man who's just killed the prime minister. And therefore, that's my responsibility on one level. So I think it's quite a complex mother and son transference going on, but it is about disintegration, and the ghost, of course, appears and then disappears for the whole play. So there's something in Shakespeare's mind about the Holy Family is completely broken up in Elsinore because of Elsinore's system of values. What power does to people, what ambition does to people. You cannot expect the family unit to survive, and perhaps he's just showing disintegration and damage. And I think that's where we try to focus the scene. But I would freely admit as a director, I think that is possibly the toughest scene I've ever had to direct. When I say toughest, I think in terms of meaning. And it's interesting with critics, you will read whole books about Hamlet and they will never, ever really go into the closet scene because there's something very mysterious going on in there, is all I'd say.
It's hugely difficult. I think you're right. It's very complicated. I think there's some truth in what you've said about his relationship with his mother previously and by comparison to his father, and that he's really in grief for what is lost in his relationship with his mother. And he's trying in some way to go back in time, perhaps, which of course he can't, to restore the mother he knew or the relationship he knew. What she's done, he can't comprehend and has removed her from him. And that disintegration, therefore, as well, as you say, he's lamenting the loss of the nuclear family, the stability that was, however configured that was, and certainly with his mother. But it's also weird because, he actually comes straight out a couple of times in the scene, and it says to her, almost as bad good mother as kill a king and marry with his brother. Does he accuse her of being complicit? Who's he saying is guilty there? And then later he talks about Claudius being a murderer. And yet Gertrude doesn't respond specifically or explicitly to either of these suggestions that Claudius is a murderer or that the king's been killed, which is also weird, I think. But as you say, I think she's caught up in witnessing the state of her son, isn't she? Because her son is so distressed. As you say, he's just killed someone. He's seeing apparitions that she doesn't see, obviously thinks, what has happened to my son? I was going to ask you just one more about that scene, is when you come out of the other side of it, how do you play then where Gertrude's loyalty lies? What does she take away from this in terms of what Hamlet's told her, what Hamlet's asked her to do in her relationship with Claudius? Do we see any change in that? Has he had any impact on her in terms of the way?
Yes, I mean, I think that's very interesting. I mean, I was going to say that it's interesting in the, I think it's Q1, so let's say the bad quarto, it's often called the much shorter version, very specifically makes a decision that Gertrude commits to Hamlet's cause. She's totally against Claudius. She allies with Horatio. I think it's a little more ambiguous than that. You're right that these accusations of murder and fly around in the scene, but there's so much else flying around.
Yeah.
It seems to me that she goes on with the sense that she's trying to protect her son always. I think she continues to do that. I think the sense of Claudius is a sense of being trapped. There's a sense of this could be true. I think there's a sense of everything's falling apart that she goes through. That's the one strong thing I think you get from Gertrude, a bit like Hecuba walking around the ruins of Troy, although she's not quite the same figure. She's a figure haunting the ruins of her dream in Elstad, to my sick soul. That short soliloquy she has about what's happening to her. I feel that all these things are in flux and they go right up to her final moment where I think she wants there to be a future in the final scene with Hamlet and Laertes. I think she sees as the last scene as her attempt to make something go forward. She asks for a public reconciliation in front of the court, which is performed. I think she wants to see a future. Claudius obviously has completely other matters. I think she only realizes what happens to her in literally her last two lines.
I think you're right about her instinct to want to fix things, and that, she'll be in some kind of doubts potentially. And how she responds to Claudius in that period after the closet scene. She does protect her son. She doesn't give him away as he requests her. Don't let him know that I'm mad in craft. She doesn't do that. He says he's mad. And perhaps she really thinks he's mad because he's been talking to ghosts. But she does protect him or tries to protect him. Whether we see any sign that she withdraws from Claudius in some way, some productions could start to do that. I don't know. It's in there potentially.
It is, yeah.
But the final scene, I'm really interested in her behavior there. I've seen productions where it's suggested that she knows the cup is poisoned when she drinks it, and therefore is protecting her son to the ultimate extent. Did you consider that? Is that possible? But how would she have known that the cup was poisoned? Well,
exactly. I mean, I find that, yes, I mean, it's very interesting what happens with the poison in the last scene, the discussions about how that whole scene works are extraordinary with actors. Everybody has a different idea. But I pretty much, looking at what Shakespeare has written, felt that she was consciously wanting to toast her son. And she picks up that cup because that's the cup that is the trophy cup that he's sold to the audience, and he's put the ring into it. So Shakespeare isn't trying to conceal the way that Hamlet's going to be poisoned at all. So I felt like it was her assertion of will opposite to his. And they're both strong-willed people, and they've had a very complicated relationship with that. But ultimately, their wills are going to lead to destructiveness on both parts. I was interested in the contradictions of a female power figure of a certain age. We see these people around the world all the time, Gertrude's, and I was interested in what might be going on in that kind of person's psyche for us now, really.
I love that idea. You said earlier, I meant to pick up on the soft power and how she's navigating the world of politics in her time. But then instinctively, the toast would have been some kind of emotional support for her son as well.
Yeah.
Which I think makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
The whole last scene is quite theatrical in a sense. It's all done for show in the court and to us. But so is the play within the play. I've always loved the play within the play scene. I know we're going backwards a bit. We'll come forward in a minute. How did you see its importance in the play, and what did you have to consider in staging it?
Well, I think it is very important. I mean, I feel that one of the things of doing Hamlet in the COVID era, which I said on the first day to everyone, was that we're all part of theatre recovering at the moment. And I feel there's a hugely powerful tribute by Shakespeare to the power of theatre. I think he absolutely puts that in as an end of century play. I think there are words in there that are about what William Shakespeare felt about theatre. I mean, Hamlet's advice to the players, it absolutely stands for all time. But I think I also wanted to try and perhaps show the way that theatre's evolved. I mean, I grew up at a time where the first big countercultural fringe companies were working physical theatre, improvisatory theatre. So I was instinctively not drawn to the text of the play within a play, which I think is very interesting. But I was just instinctively, I wanted to do a dumb show effectively, and I wanted to do a kind of Italianate noir thing. There are very particular musical references I chose. And I just wanted to get the sensation of rich, empty lives, swimming pools, and the lust for murder, and do it in a sensuous, non-verbal way. I thought it might be nice for an audience not to have to listen to dialogue for a little bit at that point in a long first half, to have the play within a play. So it was entirely my choice, really, to do it that way. I just wanted to summon up the kind of different powers of theatre. We'd seen the player with a taste of his quality. We'd seen Hamlet's speech about theatre. And I thought I wanted to use a bit of movement, a bit of dance, a bit of mime, a bit of microphone, kind of slightly DIY pop-up performance art kind of thing. And I wanted the players to be that kind of collective. You know, they have a T-shirt which has alchemical symbols on it. And, you know, it's very much a tribute to various theatre groups I grew up with and I loved. That kind of freedom of people who wanted to work outside the mainstream, create their own style of theatre.
That's great. I think that you've done a service in a way by cutting some of those speeches. It goes on a bit in quite archaic language. And what you don't want is to slow the whole thing down at that point, because the scene is really inherently so dramatic as well. The whole idea of the mouse trap is fantastic to watch. I love the idea that we're all attuned as an audience to Claudius's reaction, as Hamlet is. And we're all laser focused on that. That's a brilliant device. And of course, it's very central to the plot. It's about halfway through the play. And the fact that it affirms, at least for Hamlet, his view of that the ghost must be legitimate and Claudius has given himself away. We know we're now on the downward slope of this roller coaster, whatever this ride is, that this is going to be a fight to the death between these two from that point on. But I also think it's really clever of Shakespeare, as you say, what he talks about the theater. The implication, of course, is that we're watching something artificial in the play within the play, actually cleverly makes us think even more strongly that what we're watching is real. So the sort of layers of suspension of disbelief that go on there, it's very, very clever indeed, I think. Well, we're getting on a bit, but I still wanted to ask you, if I could, about the language and the poetry of the play. We said at the beginning that essentially Shakespeare nicked the plot, but of course his work survives not because of the original plot, but for the language he transformed. And I wanted to know how you went about addressing what to edit, because the play is the longest he wrote. How did you decide what of those great words was worth keeping and not?
Yeah, it's really tough. I mean, you kind of sit there going, this is all so wonderful. My attitude to Shakespeare text has always been, I've always edited my own text for any production I've ever done, is that if I read something that's confusing, I read the footnotes in at least 2 or 3 editions. If it's still confusing, I read it again, then I go back to the footnotes, then I have a long think, and I think, if that can't be acted in a live moment as opposed to studied, and don't get me wrong, they're 2 different things. If you have the text, you can study it and enjoy it. But if you go and see it in the theatre, you have to get in the moment. I will cut those lines unless the verse music, like in the middle of To Be or Not to Be, you wouldn't cut anything because the verse music is so perfect. So sometimes the verse music means you keep stuff, but by and large, I edited it to be things that I felt could be understood, not in a dumbing down way, but in a genuine way. And Shakespeare, I think, even by Hamlet, was still overwriting. There's no question about that. He does that in his earliest plays. I mean, Shakespeare, the wordsmith, is what all the contemporaries' tributes are to him, his obituaries, sweet expression. They all saw him as the most brilliant wordsmith, not necessarily the most profound playwright. So I think he compressed his language as he went later on, didn't he? As regard other things, I just simply had to find a way of editing the text to vaguely have it within a time schedule. That meant certain things went that I didn't want to go. These are choices you make. Some of them are your own interpretive choices. Some of them are to do with incomprehensibility. And sometimes you simply lose things you don't want to lose because you'd love to do that 4.5-hour version of Hamlet I talked about. I'm being quite honest about this. There are things there that I would love to have kept in, but you simply can't after a while because of the length of a play with only one interval. As regards the actual language, I mean, I'm a great believer in the toolbox of Shakespearean verse. I love the idea of all these different ideas, ladders of thoughts, sounds and sequences, the sensuality of vowels and consonants, the ladder of thought going forward, the way that a whole speech always starts at A and ends up at Z. For modern actors, I feel they should know about all this. But there's no definite way to speak Shakespearean verse, and it's awful when that's imposed. You should simply enjoy the sensuousness of the language. And I think the one thing I'd say about the edited text is that by cutting it, I think you get more and more famous lines coming out of you, which you had no idea came from Hamlet. They come thick and fast, I think, in this version. I mean, there were so many I hadn't seen before. Even when I went back to the play, I thought, oh no, to the manor born, that's from Hamlet.
Yes. Yes.
So it does have a kind of greatest highlights feel, I think, when you do compressing. You tend to get those lines become closer and closer together and become quite a heady experience, whereas over the whole text, they probably slot in a different way.
I agree with you that having reread it a couple of times recently, that I was surprised to discover that I thought at times that he was overwriting. The originality of it, though, apparently he used 600 words that he'd never used before in this play, 170 of which were new to the general vocabulary of the day, many of which have survived into our vocabulary as well. I applaud the idea of the clarity, of course. Shakespeare works when you don't have to struggle, when you feel that the actors understand exactly what they're saying and that they're saying it as if they're living it in a natural way. But language is so important in the play, isn't it? It's one of Hamlet's weapons, is his verbal dexterity and his intelligence. And there's just sheer beauty in it as well. That what a piece of work is man is just beautiful, intelligent speech, made all the more poignant by it being couched in his own despair, of course, at that moment. And as you say, you had to leave something behind. How all occasions do inform against me, I think you cut that completely because we don't have Fortinbras in your version of the play, which is fine. I don't think we need Fortinbras, to be honest.
But it's interesting. Well, first of all, I'll preface this by saying the scenes I cut right at the beginning, which I love. The two gravedigger scene is wonderful. The Ronaldo scene is wonderful. I mean, look, these are great scenes. I'm not even going to justify. As I said, my dream would be to direct a 5-hour Hamlet. There's no question about that. Fortinbras is more interesting because if you look at the program, you'll see that Fortinbras was in there. And I basically spent 5 weeks rehearsing Fortinbras because I do believe Fortinbras should be in the play. But I got timed out on every level. The show was so long that we simply couldn't do it like that. But hey, I know how to make a long cut. You just take Fortinbras out of the play. Everybody does that easily. I think the problem with Fortinbras is that Shakespeare thinks it's really important. There's no question about that. However, I don't think you can defend how he plots it throughout the play. It's very, very diffuse. And in one sense, trying to justify why Fortinbras turns up at the end, you can justify it by one half line that you've heard about 3/4 of an hour before. It's very hard to do, but I had plotted a plot through it, including that scene, which I rehearsed with the 4th soliloquy. I just want it on the record that as a director, I do believe in the politics of the play. However, I have to say, having tried, it is immensely hard to do in a 5-week rehearsal period.
So it's also not just the length of the performance when it comes to it, but you've had so much more to rehearse as well in the time available.
Yeah.
It's a level of political perspective on the play, which is perhaps missing a little bit if you take him out. But I don't think that's the primary thing. And of course, the way you end the play, it isn't the primary thing, I think. It's more about the personal tragedy of Hamlet. There is a succession goes on. But I wanted to ask you really about the ending of the play. How successful do you feel it is? Because just to bait you a little bit, we have just spent 3+ hours of this agonizing toing and froing with Hamlet. And then in the space of a relatively few minutes, dizzyingly fast, we have all the 4 principal characters dead and the thing wrapped up. How successful do you feel that ending of the play is?
I think it depends entirely on how you act the deaths, because I think the last words that Elizabethan characters utter on stage when they die are always crucial. So there's something about how do you actually do it. I think it is quite shocking. But then again, it has to be said that Shakespeare does see it as a succession at the end, and therefore what comes after is very crucial in Shakespeare's mind. My instinct about Fortinbras was that he's not a force for good at all. In fact, quite the opposite. It's the kind of wildness that comes out of the disintegration of Elsinore. What comes out of that is something much worse.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel that although it accelerates into the death scene at the end, I do think the last scene is very important in Shakespeare's mind. That was his intention, was to create an after where you see Horatio's attempt to tell the story and you see Fortinbras's reaction. My argument would be Shakespeare saying it's not going to be clear if Hamlet's story will ever be told or not. That's the tragedy of history. So yes, it is shocking, but I think Shakespeare constructs that pretty well, actually. I think the momentum up to the end is well constructed. I think it depends how you do the actual deaths on stage.
I think there's a certain inevitability that there's a political resolution, which I agree with you, doesn't feel entirely satisfactory or positive. The dynasty of Hamlet's died out. It's not what Denmark would have wanted. This is a foreign power has walked in now. So I'm not sure that's an ideal outcome. And I think there's a sense in the way that, as you say, Horatio starts to retell the story and Hamlet asks him to retell the story, that you're not going to get the full story. We've just seen the full story. What you're going to get is the bloody headlines. It would be a simple plot of bloody acts, as Horatio says. That's the story he's going to tell, and that's all that would survive. Speaking of survival, I guess my last question really is about the survival of this play and why it's endured for so long. We said earlier about how intelligently Shakespeare comments on the theater as being the abstract and brief chronicles of the time, and the purpose of playing is to hold the mirror up to nature. How do you think that this play speaks to our time?
Well, I think for me, probably it's 2 things, really. I think one is the generational struggle, the intergenerational conflict, and the fact that Shakespeare tells this huge story through intimate relationships, family, romantic, friendship relationships. I think that makes it extraordinarily connected to an audience. I think the other thing for me is the more political point is that I think that 99% of the countries around the world are ruled by Elsinores, you know, the seat of power, the central power. And every generation growing up has to confront that power at some point. For some people, that might be tragically at 5 years old. But in a more Western democratic place, it's probably when you're a bit older, in your 20s, that you come face to face with your inheritance, which is brutal. I mean, history is brutal. So in one sense, to me, the play will always survive as long as there are Elsinores. I fear there will be Elsinores for many more years after we've gone. Each generation will have to meet that, and each generation has their Hamlet. And I think that's why the play will endure.
Yeah, it was very striking to me in your production about the generation gap, as it used to be called when I was young, that's on display there, because I think Claudius in particular, they're dressed differently, aren't they? They're more formally dressed, the older people. And Claudius isn't speaking the same language as the young people around him, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Hamlet, and Laertes, any of these people. Polonius is not really speaking the same language as his children. So you can just see this generation gap played out. And on a macro level, about what the future holds for our world, this is playing out now in very significant terms about the world that we've created and are handing on to the next generation and their view of that. And of course, as you mentioned at the very beginning, this is an end of century play. So there's a lot of that about what is the transition? What is the next stage? Greg, we've run well over time. I'd love to do what did you say, a 5-hour, 2-interval version of this podcast, but we're going to have to draw it to a close there. Before I let you go, I hope you've been forewarned that it's one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guests to recommend a play that we could talk about in a future episode. You've directed so many. Maybe there's one you haven't directed yet that you'd like to direct. Is there a personal favorite you'd like to suggest?
Well, thanks, Douglas. Now, I have so many personal favorites, but I think having seen some of the other great choices that have already been done, which of course are plays I've either directed or would love to see, but I think I'll drop in, just for a difference, Blues for Mr. Charlie by James Baldwin.
Ah, I don't know that. Why do you choose that?
Well, it's a mighty piece. Again, it exists in various versions, but I just feel James Baldwin's a hugely important writer. And it's a very incendiary play, and I think it would be interesting to hear a discussion about it. It's a play that I felt incredibly proud to direct. I mean, it's one of my highlights of my career. It's set in the Mississippi in the early 60s. It's based on the Medgar Evers assassination. It's an explosive play, but a very powerful piece, also in different versions too. There is a 5-hour version. You might need a scholar to talk to you about that one, I think, rather than a director. But it's a fascinating one.
Yeah, I will definitely look it up. And it sounds like you're qualified to talk about it. So look out. I may come back to you. So thank you again for your Hamlet on the stage and for today. I'm really grateful for you joining me. As the curtain falls on the carnage that has completed the tragedy of Hamlet, father and son, how do we explain the seemingly endless fascination we have with this play? There are, of course, many ways that it absorbs and entertains us with tried and tested dramatic devices. A stage ghost, political ambition, a murder plot, a revenge mission, a tragic love story, family failings, wondrous poetry, and philosophical insight. But most of all, in a uniquely intelligent, sensitive, vigorous, and complex character. A character how noble in reason and infinite in faculty, but one who also ultimately defies definition, who is as brilliant and flawed and incoherent as the best of us. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at theplaypod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.